There are academics for whom this is a gold mine. One of them is Henry Jenkins, late of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, now University of Southern California. He's made a huge fortune out of this notion of convergence culture. What is convergence culture? It's the convergence of the top-down decisions made in corporate boardrooms by companies wishing to tap their cross-media ownership and the bottom-up decisions made in team bedrooms. How does it work? Well, you set up a consultancy if you're at MIT. The Convergence Culture Consortium offers companies looking to understand new strategies for doing business in a converging media environment, insights into new ways to relate to consumers, manage brands, and develop engaging experiences. So Henry Jenkins was one of the people who pioneered something that came to be called active audience studies. That he accused people like myself who spent far too much time anatomizing the kind of distribution of power and how that limited people's action, saying, look, you've got it all wrong. People are really canny, they're really able to look after themselves, and, they're not dominated at all. Well, what are the examples? The examples of people who make cut-ups of Star Trek. You can only work with what you're given. So it really does matter. Yes, you could cut it up and you can make it look like, Spock and the captain have a gay relationship, and yeah, it's quite amusing. However, it's still Star Trek. You're still locked inside an imaginative world that somebody else has manufactured for you. So there are real limits to that notion of activity and creativity. You're remoulding, you're cutting and pasting stuff that somebody else has made. You're not making something original. So this is a logical extension of the active audience. It's become hyperactive. So they're not only doing this, they're doing it all the time, and they're putting it out on YouTube and everywhere else. However, there's a counter philosophy, another way of thinking about how we might use the internet. And one of the key figures in this is Linus Torvalds, who gives his name to the Linux free domain software. This is part of the Hacker Manifesto. And for him, it's actually an ethical duty. Notice the way he uses that term, ethical. An ethical duty to share expertise. What I want to argue is that a lot of what's going on outside of the commercial orbit on the internet is actually what we can call the democratization of expertise. It's not teenage kids. It's actually professionals giving away their knowledge. Here's an interesting example. You can watch this on the web. Born of Hope is a prequel to Lord of the Rings. It tells the story of the father of Aragon, who's the king who returns in the last episode of Lord of the Rings. I'm not a big Lord of the Rings fan, but I kind of know the plot. I'm married to a New Zealander, so I'm obliged to kind of say good things about Lord of the Rings because it's one of the great triumphs of the New Zealand economy for about 50 years. It's a 70-minute feature film. It was made entirely from voluntary donations and voluntary participation. But the people who participated were professional actors, they were professional editors, they were professional scene painters and so on. They did it because they just felt it was a fun thing to do. There's an ironic twist. That you see the chainmail suit there, that the orcs are the bad guys in Lord of the Rings. That was actually donated by one of Peter Jackson's colleagues at the Weta Workshop in Wellington, who heard about this project on the web and thought it would be fun to donate something from the real Lord of the Rings. So this is an authentic Lord of the Rings cast-off prop. It's a really interesting experiment. That here you see a real gift relationship. They're not asking for anything. They just enjoy collaborating to make something that they couldn't make by themselves. Here's another example. MIT, I think, has done a quite spectacular thing in putting almost all of its course materials on the web for free. This is a course on documentary and a course on new media. If you go to the site, you can download the most spectacular material, including video, audio, all sorts of things. Now, there's a principle here which is very important. Universities have been in the front line of this demand that public institutions become more businesslike, that they might make more money from their assets. One of their great assets is the material that teaching staff produce, their ideas, their lecture notes. Distance learning is one of the great money spinners for universities. They can sell the courses all over the world and people can get a degree from Oregon if they live, in Timbuktu. What the MIT faculty said was, no, we're not going to do that because as a public institution, the public have already paid for the conditions that have allowed me to be an expert, and you shouldn't have to pay again. Now that's a very important principle, very important democratic principle. And what you see in a lot of public institutions now, including universities, is an everyday struggle between the principle of making money out of what you do and the principle of saying no, it should be part of a public commons. Here's another example. One of the great English medical specialists, John Sulston, won the Nobel Prize. He's extremely concerned about the way that medical knowledge is being patented, particularly material coming from the Human Genome Project. And as he says, what happens if something gets patented, it means that if you feel that you might have a particular condition and you need it tested, you have to pay an exorbitant sum of money for the test. His argument is that all of that knowledge, which was primarily produced in public universities, should be available to everybody as a human resource. And interestingly, if you've read your paper today, you'll see this struggle is still very active. That US District Judge Robert Sweet has struck down a company request to patent 2 genes that are crucial for the early diagnosis of breast cancer and ovarian cancer, on the grounds that the company has no claim to commercialize them. So we're in the middle of a huge battle over who owns this knowledge, how it should be distributed, who should have access to it. Another example would be the Google Digital Book Project. And since we're in a library, it's appropriate we think about that. We'll come back to that if anybody's interested, but Robert Darnton, if you don't know, is a very distinguished historian of France and is the research librarian at Harvard. One of the most important figures in the library world. He's very concerned about Google. One of the problems with there are lots of problems with Google, but the bottom line is that Google is a private corporation. So you may say, well, the guys who run it are good guys, don't do evil. But it's a private corporation. They could sell it tomorrow. They could decide to go skateboarding for the rest of their lives. And as long as you have that capacity locked up in a private corporation, you have no way of making it publicly accountable. And that's a major problem. And Google is a colonizing. It's moved into every conceivable aspect of everyday life. And it's done it without asking permission. What it does is it goes and stakes stuff out, and then if people complain, it argues it out. But it never actually negotiates anything. And it's built up an enormous corpus of knowledge, and it's a de facto monopoly. The digitalization project is a very good example. Nobody else will be able to match that. So there's no competition. You actually have a monopoly.